Okay, guys, here we are, the last part of period 6, the politics of the Gilded Age. And again, I'm going to stick to these categories. I think I can walk us through pretty good. So, as we look over here, one of the ideas that we stressed while we were learning about the politics of this era is that this is a time where, up until 1896, there's really not that much of a divide in the platform of each party. This is a time where there was still a general sense of limited government. Most government was done at the state level. And while we said, look, the term laissez faire is not the most appropriate thing, tariffs, subsidies certainly aren't laissez faire. But it's a time where this notion of government regulation, right? Look at it in terms of that context uh, of the economy. The prevailing sentiment was that the federal government took more of a hands-off approach towards that regulation. And this is a time where we had basically 80% voter turnout during presidential elections, and parties, rather than alienate anybody by taking a very divisive stand on a particular issue, everything was about party identification, getting your party out, and relying on the patronage system to dole out jobs for party support. And as a result, we had very close elections in a very divided electorate, with the exception of Harrison's term. We had a different party in the presidency and dominating Congress. And it was a time where we talked about in class much more of identity politics. Obviously, if you're in the South, you're a Democrat. This is the total solid South. Um, Union veterans, they talk about the idea of the bloody shirt and Republicans trying to appeal to the mass veteran vote. Democrats caused secession in the Civil War. Democrats assassinated Abraham Lincoln. Um, Old stock puritanical values, such as temperance, are affiliated with the Republican Party. The Republicans even labeled the Democrats as the party of rum, Romanism, and rebellion, as many urban immigrants were Democratic. And all of these elections were very close. Sometimes they call this knife edge politics. And we don't see the presidents really assume a strong executive leadership position. Remember, there's a massive gap in a strong executive between Abraham Lincoln, which would have been 1865, and Teddy Roosevelt, which would have been 1901. As we talked about, this is the day and age where patronage was everything. Where how did you get people to vote? You got people to vote through giving jobs. And we always talk about the law of unintended consequences. Well, once we started to see reform, because this was seen as being corrupt and cronyism and rewarding political hacks with these important federal jobs. Well, when you took that away, with the Pendleton Act, I know the Pendleton Act was only 10% of civil service workers, but it marked the beginning of a trend. Well, if you can't trade jobs, then you need money, and who has money? And so, historians say, like, look, this is kind of the fundamental problem with democracy, in that, it initially emerged as like, hey, let's turn out the vote by getting people jobs as government expanded. And once that was taken away, it was, well, we need money to run. And then once elected, having to serve moneyed interest. The Republican Party, again, continues to try to appeal to the mass number of Union veterans during this time. Is generally associated with being pro-business. It sort of gets away from that. By 1877, that issue of Republicans of being reform-minded along slavery and then Reconstruction went away towards being, something that was much more Hamiltonian, being very pro-business. Also, if you were into one of the social reform movements, particularly with temperance, you tended to identify as Republican. We talked about race and religion being a pretty strong part of our identification with the Republican Party. And before Jim Crow had firmly entrenched itself by the late 1890s in Williams versus Mississippi, if you were Black and you could vote in the South, you, of course, voted for the party of Lincoln. With the Democratic Party, we talked about the solid South, that's all the way up until the mid 20th century, generally advocating a more limited government, and some of your most famous big city machines, Tammany Hall, as well as in Chicago, you saw with the Democratic Party, but, Republicans had just as many political machines, Roscoe Conkling in New York. We also talked about most immigrants tended to vote Democratic as they opposed a lot of the sort of not social engineering, but the societal controls that many Republican reformers advocated. The patronage issue was a huge issue of the day. We certainly focused on that in class, and it sort of split the Republican Party. Stalwarts wanted to maintain status quo. Half-breeds demanded reform, but stalwarts said, well, the half-breeds want reform because right now we're the faction of the Republican Party in control, and we give out all the jobs. All they want to do is win so that they can start to give out the jobs. Mugwump was somebody that was a Republican and not a stalwart or a half-breed, but kind of sat the fence in between. They said that your mug was on one side of the fence and your butt was on the other side. After Rutherford B. Hayes didn't run in 1880, Garfield, who was a half-breed, was able to win the Republican convention. And he locks horns, we talked about, over the New York City's Customs House with Roscoe Conkling, head of the New York Republican machine. He is assassinated by a deranged office seeker. Chet Arthur, who was a hardcore stalwart, remember as Charles Guiteau shot Garfield, he said, "I am a stalwart and Arthur is president." Well, Arthur kind of fooled them all and was the leader for reform and signing off on the Pendleton Act, which again gave about 10% of the civil service jobs, 10% of the federal government jobs were more merit-based, test-based, based on the civil service system. The whole idea was removing federal jobs from political appointees. He did not get renominated in 1884, and an anti-corruption governor of New York, Grover Cleveland, a Democrat, is elected. A big issue during this time too was the tariff, and it split people. The industrial Northeast generally favoring higher tariffs, farmers being somewhat split on it because they benefited from keeping foreign farm products out, but at the same time it hurt their exports as other countries retaliated with tariffs. And remember, the tariff is about 50% of the revenue for the federal government. Cleveland was going to lower it. It became the big issue and cost Cleveland his reelection in 1888. The Harrison and the Republicans were able to, remember, it's a Republican president, Republican Congress. They passed the McKinley tariff, a super high tariff, which got a little bit reduced in 1894 as the Panic of 1893 was somewhat blamed on it. But then we saw under McKinley a record high tariff, an even higher tariff, the Dingley tariff of 1897. The other big issue at the national level is, what do we do with the money supply, right? As anybody that was an investor, anybody that was a banker, anybody that was a creditor, generally anybody that was pretty wealthy favored hard money, and not expanding the money supply, as that would make each dollar less valuable. Remember, from 1865, the end of the war, up until 1890, the value of a dollar basically tripled because of deflation, because we're producing much more stuff. The currency remains pretty stable, i.e. relative to each good produced, a dollar becomes worth more. And as the country fell into a deep depression in 1873, a lot of people blamed that on that silver was taken out of circulation, the crime of 73, and the fact that there were no more greenback dollars. As of 1875, there was no more paper currency that wasn't backed in gold in circulation. It was actually a political movement for the government to issue money that wasn't backed by gold. There was a compromise passed in 78 and again in 90 that coined some silver, but not enough to satisfy a lot of Midwest farmers and poor people, particularly debtors that wanted more money. Remember, farmers want more currency because farm prices are low. And when Morgan had to bail out after the Panic of 1893, as the country had run short of gold, it gave more credence to the charge that the government stayed on this very strict gold standard, not coining more money based on silver because it was in the interest of big bankers. Very good. Okay. Okay. All right. And that's just tied back into the crime of 73. Okay. All right. I don't know why I had that over there. All right. So as we talk about politics finally becoming, you have two distinct parties by 1896. And yeah, there were issues on patronage. Yeah, there were issues on the tariff. Yeah, there were issues on the money supply, but it takes some time. And you had an evolution to where the government started to do a lot more. That famous $1 billion Congress with expanded pensions, and you started to see the at least the ostensible regulation of big business with the Sherman Act and with the Interstate Commerce Act. But remember, this is still a time where the courts narrowly interpret the federal government's powers, such as in US v. E.C. Knight, and there's no real regulation. And so, as we talked about with the Granger movement, we have a legit third party with the Populists by 1892. They tried to ally people based on economic interest, but the racism in the South trumped that. And despite Tom Watson's best efforts, you did not see. In fact, there was so much fear by the Democrats that the populist movement would present a united front that's where you see the massive amount of literacy tests, grandfather clauses, poll taxes to keep blacks in the South from voting, as there's no unified front based on class, particularly in the South. We talked at length in class about the Omaha platform. Remember, that's the initial Populist Party platform that came out of Omaha in 1892. Things like a direct election of U.S. senators, a graduated income tax, referendums on laws, public ownership of utilities, public ownership of the railroads. With discontent over how much money the federal government was spending in high tariffs, Cleveland was able to win his non-consecutive terms in 1892. But then we had the Panic of 1893. You had the mass marching of Coxey's Army in 1894 demanding federal relief, demanding a federal public works program, and none of that happened. And then there was a illustrated book called Coins Financial School, which furthered the idea that the economy was stagnant because it was being run for the interest, again, on the gold standard of large businesses and large bankers. So the big idea is the stage was set for a real political showdown in 1896 with two distinct views. We spent a lot of time. Remember, we read the article Titans about this. Well, Williams Jennings Bryan, with his Cross of Gold speech, takes over the Democratic Convention in 1892. They begin to have a fusion ticket with the Populists as they favored that unlimited coinage of silver at a 16-to-1 ratio. Some conservative Democrats, particularly in Northeast industrial regions, feared inflation and bolted to the Republican cause. This was the time, remember, we saw modern campaigning. Bryant's whistle-stop tour giving over 600 speeches. Mark Hanna, remember, we saw that from the Men That Built America, where the titans of Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Morgan financed the campaign through the industrialist Mark Hanna. And it was a big deal because Hanna spent a ton of money on the newspapers, and it was the first time where this sort of modern campaign spending really made a difference. Between that and, as we talked about in class, not only did you have the defection of gold bug Democrats, but workers in the Northeast were told, if Bryan wins, we're going to close down. We can't do business anymore. As McKinley won, the economy turned around because there was so much gold discovered in Alaska that the money supply did expand. And you started to see this transition of, okay, it appears as if farmers and this real notion of limited government isn't going to dominate politics. It now seems as if, the sort of Eastern industrial urban vote is going to start to carry the day. And moving forward, we'll see McKinley starts to do a few things that set the stage for modern presidency, i.e. the Spanish-American War, but we'll see that it is Roosevelt that really takes that to the next level. And I believe, yeah, that is it. We have covered the major political ideas from this time period. All right. Thanks, guys.